So we've worked through Guam. That's our first notch creation. And don't worry, that one is way longer. That might as well be 4 notches because that seems like a lot of material. We're going to move way faster through fall, flood, and tower. But this has helped setting our understanding of the whole story of the Bible up. And we're going to draw some more stuff here in a minute. And so what we want to do is we got to get a picture of what's happened. We got to understand the story first. Otherwise, what God is doing with the rest of the story won't make much sense. So we've just come off of Genesis 1 and 2, where God has created humans. He has invited them to sacred space to enjoy the blessing of God and then to take that blessing out into the rest of the world to image back Him. And then we ask the question, what broke it? And that's when we get to what we call the fall. So creation, fall. There's where we're at. And I think this definition on page 22 is, I think, a really helpful definition. Just hear this. It says, the fall is the event in which Adam and Eve, the first humans, disobeyed the explicit command of God, thereby bringing sin and death onto the human race. As a consequence of the fall, humans have become alienated from God. Hear it. We've been alienated from each other, and we've been alienated from the entire created order. Let's look at the story. I think it's familiar to most of us. Notice all these will begin with the letter T. First the tempter, then the temptation. First the tempter. It says, now the serpent. Here comes a creature who is going to simply offer an alternative. He's going to offer a doubt. And we see the story. He's crafty. And here he shows up. We don't get any of the explanation of who this serpent is, why is it there, and if you're like me, what I want the Bible to do is give me a long bullet point answer to the problem of evil and its origins in the world if God is all good and all perfect. And we don't have it. And what we're going to have to do is let the story speak for itself, and then we're going to orient our understanding of our world and our lives to this story. And so there are a lot of things that this story does leave out, and we have to be okay with that. Now look at the story and how it unfolds. He said to the woman, did God really say? It's this Hebrew word that essentially is bringing doubt to the table. It's bringing an air of flippancy. Did He really say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? And the woman said, no. He said, we may eat of any of the fruit trees in the garden, but you shall not touch the fruit that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it lest you die, the tree that's in the middle. And notice what the serpent does. And I think this is a really helpful box, this on page 23. He begins with doubt. Did God really say? He moves to denial. You won't die. And lastly, the full-blown deception. You will be like God. Here's the irony. They were already made in the image of God. And here He comes and offers, you can be like God. You can reach out and grab wisdom all on your own. You can take it for yourself. You don't have to listen to God, obey God, trust God, grab it on your own. And this same tactic is prevalent in our world today. See it in my life. I'm sure you see it in your life. This same tactic keeps working. And look at what happens in Genesis 3:6. As the woman saw that the tree was good for food and delight to the eyes and desired to make one wise, she saw, she grabbed it, and she ate it. And this tactic of this accuser, this serpent, is going to be all over the Bible. God has invited humans to experience blessing, and instead, here comes this serpent to say, you can have it all on your own. And we see, as the story unfolds, you can turn the page to page 24, the tragedy. She took of its fruit. She listened to the voice of the serpent. She gave some to her husband who was there. We don't know where. We don't know when Adam showed up. We don't know if he's been there the whole time. We don't know how long later this was. But here he is, and he falls to the same exact tactic. And then look at verse 7. This is supposed to be like tragic. We're supposed to read this, and it's supposed to hurt when we read this. Verse 7. The eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And I would just simply note, to me, verse 7 is a summary statement of every other religious system and worldview ideology in our world. Humans know there's something off, there's something broken. We know that there's shame and corruption and greed and selfishness instead of selflessness and goodness. We see that in the human condition. And every single worldview system is essentially this. How can we fix the mess that we find ourselves in? How can we pull ourselves out of it? And humans love to try to fix the mess that we've made on our own efforts. It doesn't say they turned immediately to Yahweh and said, we've messed up, would you redeem us? It says no, they immediately sowed fig leaves for themselves and they began to try to fix it on their own. And this is every single worldview system, every religious system that we see in our world. It's essentially, how can we fix it on our own and get out of the mess that we find ourselves in? The result, there's spiritual death, separation from God. There's a deadness now. And I'm going to draw this so we can see it. When we look at our ancient Near Eastern, this is from the side view. If we look from the top down at the world, this is how an ancient Near Eastern person understood the world to exist. It was a flat earth. We got to be okay with it. That's how they saw it. And there was a landmass in the middle. There was water outside of it. How do we know that there was water outside of it? Because when we go to the end of the landmass, we see water there. So it makes sense. And yeah, there's mountains probably on the edges of this thing. And what God is trying to do is God builds a garden and he invites humans into this garden. And the design is that humans would then bring God's blessing out to the rest of the world. But in this moment, what we're going to see is instead of blessing going out, because of this temptation, because of their failure, now there is a power and a force that's dark and black, and it's powerful and it's enslaving. And this power essentially says, you can have it on your own. Reach out and take it on your own. And now instead of blessing going out, the power of darkness is going out. And we're going to come back to this drawing over and over again in Panorama because this is going to be the story that the Scripture is telling. God created humans to bring blessing out into the world, and instead, now we bring this power of sin out into the world. And what God does is he initiates judgment. We're going to see this in Genesis chapter 3. We're going to zero in on it real fast. The first we see is he judges the serpent. Now notice what he says. He says, and you need to open your Bible. It's not printed here, so let's look at it. He says, so Yahweh God said to the serpent, because you've done this, cursed are you above all livestock. And now look at verse 15. We call this the first gospel. The fancy way to say it is the proto-evangelion, but nobody needs to know that. Here is our first indication of what is God's plan to fix what we've broken. Adam and Eve went and tried to sow fig leaves for themselves. What's God's plan? Well, we're going to see it. God says this little note that just sits there, and it's in a poetry. Look at what God says. He says to the serpent, I will put enmity or hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. So we might just note that we have the serpent, and then we have the woman. And now we're getting told that they're both going to have seed or offspring. And we know what it's telling us is there is a war, or enmity is what it's calling it, between these two. There's a battle, there's a problem, there's a showdown between these two. And what the story then goes on to tell us is this. There is a seed who is coming of the woman who will strike the serpent, yet that seed will also be struck, will be bruised. So this seed will experience a bruise on the foot or on the heel, and the serpent will receive, we might call it a death blow, a fatal blow to the head. And right off the bat, here we go. In our Bible, the Bible is already beginning to tell us a story. We find ourselves, instead of blessing going out, we have this thing called selfishness and greed. We call it sin, this force going out. And from the very beginning, God says, I am going to make a promise. Here's that promise. That I'm sending a he. Who's the he? It's a third person masculine singular pronoun. There is a he who is coming. And that he will crush the head of the serpent. And I want you to write down next to letter A there where it says the serpent, just write, who is the snake crusher? Who's the he? Where is the snake crusher who is going to come? And the story of the Bible is going to be addressing that question. Now, we know as we turn the page, it's going to be Jesus. But we want to see the story unfold first from the Old Testament's perspective. And then Jesus is going to come in and be defined as the one that we're expecting, the third person masculine singular he. But we get our very first note of what's God's solution to the problem right here in Genesis 3:15. Now, to the woman and the man. Notice, neither the woman or the man are actually cursed. It says, to the woman, I will make your pains greater in Now, we get this weird. It seems like it's just saying the process of giving birth, but it's actually a little bit bigger than that. What it's trying to communicate is the entire process from conception to raising kids. All of that, the thing that woman is supposed to be a blessing for women in this world, is now going to experience toil. It's not just pain in childbirth, we now have epidurals, guess we fixed it. It's way bigger than that. It's the pain of knowing you're bringing kids into a fallen world where now sin is ruling. It's the pain of infertility. It's the pain of miscarriage. It's the pain of all of these things that we see in our world. It's not going to be toilsome. And the second thing it says is, instead of having oneness in the marriage, and unity and harmony in marriage, it says your desire will be for your husband. And that same word desire is used in the very next chapter, chapter 4, verse 7, to talk about a desire for mastery. Now, instead of harmony, there's going to be toil, fracturing. There's going to be hostility. We might say the two things that women are made to experience blessing in raising kids and having kids and in marriage, is now going to be filled with all sorts of toil. And we definitely see that in our world. And we see the very next thing. It says to the man, cursed is the ground, not man, but cursed is the ground. And now the thing that man is wired to do to bring God's blessing out into the world will now war against him, will produce thorns and thistles. Toil is the idea. And we have a podcast on our Out of Curiosity podcast that I think we called it The Effects of Genesis 3 on My Life. And we dive into some of this in more detail. But I think this is giving us a backdrop for all of the human condition. And so we go creation, fall, flood, and tower. And if you see the story of the flood, what we're essentially expecting is this. The fall is going to get much worse. What we have in the story is we have Adam and Eve, a couple, and they fall victim to sin. So they fall victim. In chapter 4, we're going to see Cain and Abel. Things are going to get way worse now. Now we have an entire family who's going to fall victim to the power of sin. And then we're going to see, as the story goes, we're going to have Lamech building an entire city, essentially bragging about killing. Now it's getting bigger and bigger. And with the flood, we're going to see the whole land is going to be filled with pain and violence, as if the ripple effects of the fall are going out farther and farther. As we look at page 25, that's the flood account. You can see the flood. It's described in Genesis 6 to 8, and then we have the post-flood condition. But here's the sad note. It's what we see listed here, number 2, the sin condition before the flood. Notice it. The Lord saw the wickedness of mankind, that it was great in the earth, that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And that's the story. It's reached a point where now this power of sin is going out, and it's dominating, and it owns humanity. And I think a lot of us are familiar with the flood story. Here's what I might just say. It's one of the first stories our kids learn, and we see it on felt boards and little books with animals and stuff. If you think about the story, it's not a cute story, right? This is the story of God bringing judgment on the whole land. And so we have to get the story right. The power and this force called sin and evil, it's so great that this is its effect. And we're familiar with the story. Lastly, we come to the Tower of Babel. So creation, fall, flood, tower. We might notice when we talk about the tower, what we see is we're going to have a place called Babel or Babylon. Babylon. Now we have an entire culture and civilization built on the concept of taking wisdom, taking power for yourself, completely divorced from God. That's what's going on in the tower story. And we can see it here on page 26. It said, God blessed humanity and said, take that blessing out. But instead, what have humans done? Instead of experiencing the blessing of God in his sacred temple space, humans are now on their own building a temple space and trying to force the gods to function on their own terms and on their own behalf. If you think of what the tower is, if you Google search ziggurats, Babylonian ziggurats, that's going to give you a better picture probably. And the ziggurats function as a way to invite the deity down into your place, into your land. So essentially what we have is humans are now building towers, they're building temple spaces to invite the gods to come act on their behalf, demanding they act on their behalf instead of trusting in Yahweh. It's tragic. God's invited us into blessing. And instead, we keep taking it on our own. And as we finish with the prologue of the Panorama timeline, we see God has made this world for His glory and our joy, and it's been broken by this thing that we call sin. And that power is having ripple effects out into all of the world. And the story of the Bible and the story of the Panorama timeline is going to be this. What is God going to do about this broken world? How will He respond? And as we finish the prologue, that's where we're going to be going next week. So here's our 4 notches. The first movement of the Panorama timeline is prologue or introduction. And the 4 key events are creation, fall, flood, tower. And we'll have some back and forth on the Google Classroom talking and chatting about some of this, but this is getting the ball rolling for us. Let me encourage you, maybe sit down and read Genesis 1 to 11 over the next week. Maybe break it up in a couple of days, maybe read creation, then fall, flood, tower, different days. But let's dive into the biblical story and we'll continue on our journey and we'll pick up movement 2.